Origins of Modern Liberalism, Woodrow Wilson, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I talked a little bit about Wilson himself and, in a general sense, his criticisms of American government and especially his notion of vigorous leadership by the president. One of the reasons why I talked about that is because that doesn't really come up in your reading, so I wanted you to know about it since it wasn't in your reading. Now, in this lecture, we move on to talking about the way that Wilson characterized the challenges that American society faced as a result of the changes that had occurred over especially the last half of the 19th century. And Wilson, to put it briefly, believed that conditions had changed to such an extent in the United States that many of the founding principles, whatever their merits had been in 1789 or 1776, had been rendered obsolete, that they just weren't suited to the current character of American society. And here I will read from page 185 the opening of this chapter. Now, I should say these come from a book called The New Freedom, A Call for the Emancipation of the Generous Energies of a People. That is a book that he published. It is made up of speeches that he gave during his presidential campaign, his successful presidential campaign in 1912. So these are campaign speeches. As you can imagine, after you've read it, you can see obviously that presidential rhetoric used to be a lot more demanding than it has been over the last, 30 years or so. But so here's what he says at the beginning. There is one great basic fact that underlies all the questions that are discussed on the political platform at the present moment. That singular fact is that nothing is done in this country the way it was done 20 years ago. We are in the presence of a new organization of society. Our life has broken away from the past. The life of America is not the life it was 20 years ago. It's not the life that it was 10 years ago. We have changed our economic conditions absolutely from top to bottom. And with our economic society, the organization of our life. And what he means by that is, obviously the process of industrialization and the way that it brought about urbanization, the people leaving the countryside, leaving the agrarian way of life, becoming industrial workers. You also have the rise of the professional middle class in the towns and all that. So you've had a major change in the economy. And, as you all know, people build their lives around their jobs. The way that people make a living has an effect on their whole quality of life. A predominantly agricultural country has a different way of life than a predominantly urban one. We know this very well. It's at the basis of some of the political tensions that exist in America and in other countries today. So what Wilson is referring to here is that the great sort of economic revolution of the 19th century, industrialization, had just totally changed American society in ways partly that he thought were harmful. But so in the wake of these changes, he says, the old political formulas do not fit the present problems. They read now like documents taken out of a forgotten age. The older cries sound as if they belong to a past age when men have almost forgotten. Things which used to be put into party platforms 10 years ago would sound antiquated if put into a platform now. We are facing the necessity of fitting a new social organization, as we did once fit the old organization, to the happiness and prosperity of the great body of citizens. For we are conscious that the new order of society has not been made to fit and provide the convenience or prosperity of the average man. And that's the end of that long quotation. Now, again, to put it somewhat briefly, this is the idea that we now are a nation predominantly of city dwellers and people who work in professional middle-class jobs or in working-class industrial jobs, and that's not the yeoman farmer and artisan America of the late 1800s. So he said a few things. He said things have changed, that the old principles can't really address the challenges that we have nowadays. And he notes that the changes in society so far have not been ones that work to the advantage of the average man. So in other words, despite all the potential unleashed by industrialization, he believed that America in the 19 teens had a social order that was less favorable to the interests of the average citizen than it had been, say, 100 years ago. And so I want to explain a little bit about why. So he says, this is at the last paragraph on 185. He says, we have come upon a very different age from any that preceded us. We have come upon an age when we do not do business in the way in which we used to do business, when we do not carry on any of the operations of manufacture, sale, transportation, or communication as men used to carry them on. There is a sense in which in our day the individual has been submerged. In most parts of our country, men work not for themselves, that is, they're not independently self employed, nor as partners in the old way in which they used to work, but generally as employees in a higher or lower grade of great corporations. There was a time when corporations played a very minor part in our business affairs, but now they play a chief part, and most men are the servants of corporations. So that's the first thing. The emergence of big business, the emergence of corporations. As he's saying, it used to be the case that most Americans were either self-employed or they were partners with other people in business ventures or other kind of ventures. That in other words, a lot of people, even if they didn't have a lot of money, they didn't necessarily have a boss. Right? You might have been poor, but you didn't have a boss. Whereas what he's saying is nowadays, a very large proportion of Americans who work work for larger organizations, and they're just an employee. They have a boss. They're a salaried or wage earning employee of some larger organization. And as he says, this causes people to become submerged. And here he means not just the working class, but also a lot of middle managers and things like that. I could bring out multiple anecdotes from The Office to illustrate what he's talking about here, but I'm sure you can supply your own examples. So he goes on, as he says in the first full paragraph on page 186, you know what happens when you are the servant of a corporation. You have in no instance access to men who are really determining the policy of the corporation. If the corporation is doing the things that it ought not to do, you really have no voice in the matter and must obey the orders. And you have oftentimes, with deep mortification, to cooperate in the doing of things which you know are against the public interest. Your individuality is swallowed up in the individuality and purpose of a great organization. So in other words, you become a cog in a machine that you have no control over. And, that is the case for most people who work for a large corporation, right? If you work for Bank of America or something like that, most people who work for Bank of America have zero influence over how Bank of America runs things. You're just an employee carrying out the orders. And his point here is that in the past, when people were self-employed or worked as partners, they actually had kind of more control over the conditions of their work, in the sense that obviously if you were self-employed, it was not possible for your boss to force you to do something that you thought was bad. Like hide records of pollution or something like that, because you don't have a boss. Nobody can force you to do that. Same thing if you're in a partnership. Your partner can't force you the way a boss can force you to do things you don't want to do. So even though people probably had more limited opportunities in some ways, and they had less wealth in the early 1800s than they did in Wilson's time, it's nonetheless the case that Wilson thought that in a certain way you as an individual had more power over your own economic life back in the old days than you do in the age of big business and corporations. So on the one hand, the average person gets kind of submerged, and you end up with these big corporations that are running the show in the economic life of the country. Then on the other hand, though, as he notes, even as many people are disempowered, the same phenomenon of the rise of big business and the modern corporation creates a new, quite small class of hyper-empowered, very wealthy individuals who have a kind of power and influence that nobody had in any previous era. As he says in the next paragraph, it is true that while most men are thus submerged in the corporation, a very few, are exalted to a power which as individuals they could never have wielded. Through the great organizations of which they are the heads, a few are enabled to play a part unprecedented by anything in history in the control of the business operations of the country and in the determination of the happiness of great numbers of people. Right, just think of Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, people like that, the heads of these big corporations. His point is, once upon a time there weren't billionaires, right? And you didn't have these people who, through their stock ownership and their leadership positions in corporations, had such massive wealth and massive influence over the fate of others. And a clear example here would be something like Henry Ford, who ran the Ford company, manufacturing automobiles. Ford's decisions about where to build a factory could have an effect on the livelihoods and life prospects of thousands of families, right? A decision that was ultimately up to him as an individual could affect the fate of thousands of families and the livelihoods of thousands of families. And Wilson's point is that, back in like 1820 or something, there was nobody who had that kind of power. Yeah, you had rich bankers and you had wealthy people, of course. America had a significant class system in the 1800s. But nonetheless, it wasn't the case that there were particular rich people who held the fates of so many people in their hands by virtue of their position atop this large economic organization, for the simple reason that there weren't these large economic organizations. You didn't have corporations in the same way. So what Wilson is talking about here, you could think about how over the last couple of years, how various cities were bidding to become the site of Amazon.com's new headquarters, right? So the way that the decision of a board of directors about where to place a headquarters can have a massive influence on the economic health of an entire region. That's the kind of phenomenon that Wilson's talking about. He said that's just unprecedented. Things like that didn't exist in America in the 1800s, back in the frontier days, back in the older pre-industrial days. So, and this is a version of what, coming out of Occupy Wall Street, sometimes people talk about the 99% and the 1%, the idea that the 1% of the population, obviously these are not strictly accurate numbers, it's more like the 0.01% or whatever, but, that you have a small number of people with massive wealth. And then you kind of have everybody else, and this concern that really the country is being run more in the interests, being run kind of more by and for the 1% than for the people as a whole. So that complaint goes way back in American politics. As he sums it up in the next paragraph on page 186, yesterday and ever since history began, men were related to one another as individuals. To be sure, there were the family, the church, and the state, institutions which associated men in certain wide circles of relationships, right? So we were individuals, but we belonged to larger groups. It says, but in the ordinary concerns of life, in the ordinary work, in the daily round, men dealt freely and directly with one another, right? Because they were a lot of them self-employed or what have you. Today, the everyday relationships of men are largely with great impersonal concerns, with organizations, not with other individual men. End of quotation. So these are these new circumstances, the sort of industrialization leading to the importance of corporations and the elevation of a very wealthy few and the subordination of most of the rest of society. Now, you can find historians and economists, obviously, who will disagree with or at least qualify this characterization as saying this is an exaggeration. And of course, this is political rhetoric, so there is going to be some exaggeration here. But this is the story that he's telling. And a lot of people found it compelling then as today. But what he goes on to say then in the next few paragraphs, and this is all I'm going to get into in the remainder of this lecture, is that these new conditions reveal that the principles of the founding are inadequate for dealing with the nation's problems. When these are the nation's problems, the founding principles are inadequate. Now here, this is the paragraph in 186 that begins with WW19 in the square brackets. Here he is giving his version of Merriam's contrast between the protection theory of government and the general welfare theory of government. As he says, we used to think in the old-fashioned days, when life was very simple, that all that government had to do was put on a policeman's uniform and say, now don't anybody hurt anybody else. We used to say that the ideal of government was for every man to be left alone and not interfered with, except when he interfered with somebody else. And that the best government was the government that did as little governing as possible. That was the idea that obtained in Jefferson's time. Right, so that's his account of the old view, the protection theory. Government's there to make sure that people don't hurt one another, and otherwise to leave people alone, to let them run their lives for themselves. That government governs best, which governs least. Right? Protect me from harm, leave me alone. That's the way he's characterizing the old view. But he goes on to say, but we are coming now to realize that life is so complicated that we are not dealing with the old conditions, and that the law has to step in and create new conditions under which we may live, the conditions which will make it tolerable for us to live. He goes on to illustrate this, but I want to pause here because I cannot emphasize enough how important that statement is for understanding the contrast between the founders' view of government and the progressive view of government. So first of all, remember, he said, so the conditions are so complicated that old leave us alone approach to government won't work anymore. Implicitly, he's saying back in the simpler kind of frontier times, the protection theory of government made sense. Just protect people, leave them alone, let them govern their own things. Because again, in the economic sphere, there was a lot of self-determination. But in an era where the economic and therefore the social life of the country is affected to a very large degree by the decisions of really only a handful of powerful kind of corporations, that old view of all I need to be free is to be left alone, that doesn't work anymore, right? Leaving people alone translates to laissez-faire approach to the market, translates to letting the corporations run things. That's the progressive view. To have a government, have a minimal protection theory government that just steps back and says, look, we will provide rule of law, protect people from harm, otherwise people are on their own. That in effect, what that does is it causes government to step back and let the market, which is to say the powerful corporations that dominate the market, run American life. And that, for the progressives, that's not freedom. That doesn't make you free, because if you're one of the servants of the corporation, then letting the corporations do whatever they want is not enhancing your freedom. It's enhancing their freedom and their wealth, but not yours. And then, as I said, I cannot emphasize how important this is. As he says, the law has to step in and create new conditions under which we may live, the conditions which will make it tolerable for us to live. Now, that's his version of the general welfare view, but I think he expresses this very clearly and precisely here in saying the job of the government is not simply to prevent harm. The job of government is actually to reorganize and regulate social institutions with a view to improving the condition and the opportunities of citizens. That's a much more positive and active view of government. Part of the job of government is not just to prevent harm, but to reconstruct social institutions in a way more favorable to the welfare of ordinary Americans. And he goes on and he gives an example on pages 186 and 187. And this is an important example, so I'm going to read it and bring out what he's talking about. So as he says, let me illustrate what I mean. It used to be true in our cities that every family occupied a separate house of its own, that every family had its own little premises, that every family was separated in its life from every other family, right? So each person in their own house, their own private domain, their own private property. That is no longer the case in our great cities. Families live in tenements. They live in flats. They live on floors. They are piled layer upon layer in the great tenement houses of our crowded districts. And not only are they piled layer upon layer, but they are associated room by room, so that there is in every room, sometimes in our congested districts, a separate family. So in other words, you're talking about these large tenement houses, these huge, densely occupied apartment buildings where people don't live in a separate place. They actually just occupy a room or an apartment within a larger complex. And he says sometimes you have multiple families in the same apartment. And this still exists today, especially with some immigrant communities in the cities where multiple families will share the same apartment or share the same house. That's what he's talking about, this kind of urban crowding. And he talks about, well, how do you deal with this? And he says, in some foreign countries, they have made much more progress than we in handling these things. In the city of Glasgow, for example, that's Scotland, they have made up their minds that the entries and hallways of great tenements are public streets. Therefore, the policeman goes up the stairway and patrols the corridors. The lighting department of the city sees to it that the lights are abundantly lighted. The city does not deceive itself into supposing that great building is a unit from which the police are to be kept out and the civic authority to be excluded. But it says, These are public highways, and light is needed in them and controlled by authority of the city. End of quotation. So in other words, the old view would say, well, look, this building is private property. It's owned by somebody. So this is not a place, the police patrol the public streets. They don't patrol private homes. The police don't patrol private property, right? And the lighting company doesn't go in and check the lights, right? Like the electric company doesn't come in and check my lights in my house, right? So the old view is these tenement houses, they're owned by somebody, the landlord or whatever, and it's private property. It's not public property. And he says Glasgow understands that's not really the way it works. These buildings are so big, they house so many houses, there's so much life going on in them, and challenges to public order going on, the social life that goes on in the hallways, that the public authority has decided, what, even though maybe technically in some ways these buildings are private property, in another sense they hold so many families and so much is going on in them that they're actually kind of quasi-public property, and therefore should be patrolled by the police to make sure that law and order and peace and safety are being maintained in them. And you should make sure they're well lighted and things like that. So in the old view, this is just a black box. It's a piece of private property and the public authority shouldn't go into it. And he says that shouldn't be the view anymore. When something is that big and consequential to the lives of that many families, then it must be subject to public regulation. And then he draws out the analogy in the next paragraph. He says, I liken that our great modern industrial enterprises, right? It says, I liken that to our great modern industrial enterprises. A corporation is very like a large tenement house. It isn't the premises of a single commercial family. It is just as much a public affair as a tenement house is a network of public highways. End of quotation. So in other words, in the same way back in the old days, each business was maybe owned by one family or one person. And in that sense, it was the property of that one person. The idea this isn't a public entity. This is private property, right? This carpenter's shop belongs to this carpenter and his tools are his tools and it's on his property and it's not public property. And he can do with it as he will, as long as he doesn't hurt other people. And what he says is that way of thinking about business might have made sense when there are lots and lots of individually owned small businesses. But when you're in a country where a lot of the economic life of the nation is dominated by these massive corporations, whose decisions affect the livelihood of thousands of individuals and families. It says in that case, much like a tenement house, a corporation should really be treated as a kind of quasi-public entity. It's not a black box that government should stay away from. Because corporations have so much power and so much influence over the quality of people's lives and their opportunities and their condition, it follows that corporations also should be more tightly regulated by the government in the name of the common good. Whether you're talking about workplace safety regulations, right? There really wasn't any need in, say, 1810 for localities to make public safety regulations for like carpenter shops or whatever. Somebody was a carpenter, they worked out of their own home. If they want to work under unsafe conditions, they're only risking themselves. But when you have a large corporation with lots of employees, the government's decided you have a responsibility to maintain certain minimal health and safety standards for anybody that works for you. And other decisions like you need to provide health care, you need to provide sick days, you need to provide vacation time, and so on and so forth. You think about it, businesses are subject to lots of different kinds of regulations. They weren't 150 years ago. Right, the tighter regulation of how businesses govern themselves internally and how they act in the marketplace, the tighter regulation in those areas is a product of these periods of reform when people such as Wilson argued these corporations are too big and too powerful to just simply be left alone, laissez-faire. They've got as they go about their business, they have to follow rules to ensure that as they pursue profit, they do so in a way that is consistent with the good of their workers and that's consistent with the good of the broader society. Right, so that's his view. So we need to create these new conditions. Now, of course, if you hold to the principles of the founding, you would say that's just not the job of government. The job of government isn't to create social conditions. It's there to protect the natural rights of individuals. And so what I'll get to in the next lecture is that in the same way that Wilson diagnoses what he sees as new problems and argues that therefore we need a new approach to government in order to solve those problems, he also lays down some intellectual principles to show why it is right and proper for us to move beyond the principles of the founding. So that's what we'll get to in the next lecture.